Hello, and welcome to Morgan Meets the Eye. My name is Evan Morgan, and I am the host of this series. This installment's guest is a figure within libertarianism who I think certainly deserves the title of Renaissance Man. This is somebody who has given lecture after lecture on liberty and Austrian economics, and not to mention the problems and evils that come with statism. He has published nonfiction works such as The Definitive Guide to Libertarian Voluntarism, as well as writing fiction, albeit highly informative fiction, through his comic book series Voluntarist. As far as the show's typical subject matter, comic books are certainly out of the ordinary, but this is to say nothing of my guest's work in the music industry. He has made many songs and music videos, mostly in the hip-hop genre, that feature highly libertarian and anti-statist themes and messages. This guest's unique but profound style is sure to bring today's discussion into new territory, and I for one welcome that. I am speaking, of course, about the one and only Jack V. Lloyd. This is episode 17 of Morgan Meets the Eye, in which Lloyd and I discuss his work in fiction and nonfiction, his music, and many other subjects. Hi, Jack, and thanks for appearing on Morgan Meets the Eye. I appreciate the appearance. Before we jump into anything, where should my listeners go to check out any of your work?
Well, thank you so much, Evan. I appreciate you having me on again. To go check out my work, I have a great website, Jack, Jack, V as in voluntarist, Lloyd, Lloyd, that's jackvloyd.com. And that kind of is a hub for a lot of the different things I do. So you can navigate over there to my comics, my nonfiction books, and some of my social media sites, as well as check out some of the music I produce. And then, of course, my comic website, the direct one is Volcomic. That's V as in voluntarist, VOLCOMIC.com. And between those two places, you can pretty much find everything else I do because I am all over the internet in so many different ways. It's kind of hard to keep track. But at least between those two sites, you'll probably find the most important things.
So before we get into any of this, I should mention, the whole story behind this. This is not really the first time I've spoken with you. I did originally meet you at PorkFest this past June. I met you and your wife, the philosopher, who were essentially, holding an event there. And as far as this particular topic, I'd heard of you prior to that point, though. I'd heard, about your work in different areas throughout the libertarian movement. So, but basically, though, speaking on the topic of PorkFest, as far as an annual gathering of libertarians, I'm curious what you would have to say about PorkFest as an organization, and not just that, but also the Free State Project, which sponsors it, and basically just the idea of libertarians unifying in one place such as this. What do you think the importance of unity and joining together as libertarians would be?
Sure. So PorkFest is great. I had a great time. I've known about it for many years and finally got a chance to make it out for the 20th anniversary. And I think it's an excellent way to connect with the people who love liberty, who are really passionate. You get all kinds of people from all walks of life there. So you really get to see the full gamut of people who appreciate self-ownership and consent and bodily autonomy. And so it's just a wonderful time to just kind of commune with those people and to feel inspired. And of course, to check out the wider Agora, the market there. They have a lot of great vendors who are selling all kinds of things you can imagine, from edible things to toys to different types of survivalist tools. It's really cool. It's really something special. And I think the Free State Project is fantastic. I've always been a fan of their work. I think that their work of trying to get enough of a hub of libertarians in New Hampshire to try to move New Hampshire in a more liberty-friendly direction, I think is great and admirable. I think that if it's something that interests you, it's certainly one of the better projects out there to check out when it comes to creating a community, especially if you're an American. It's relatively easy to get on over there. So I definitely support what they do conceptually, even though I'm definitely a devout Florida man, but I'm a fan of people who are trying to build new things and new ways for people to resist state force, and doing so while creating some great times and fun events and fun ways to interact. So I think that is also what makes it fun, is that when you have a project like that, you want to make sure you're doing something that leaves people with a good taste in their mouths, and that you have a good time. And there's been ups and downs, of course, over the years, and different people coming and going, but overall the group and the branding and the overall organization is great, and I appreciate the work they're doing.
Yes, just based off of the progress that the Free State Project has made so far, I do see that as something that I'm very optimistic about. And I do think that, I do certainly hope that in the near future they'll be able to meet the goal that they're seeking as far as libertarians, within that state. But before we get into anything else, I kind of wanted to speak on you as a guest. You are something that I kind of describe as a Renaissance man in the libertarian field here. So I know that you've worked in many different areas. So first off, we should probably start by discussing your work with the comic book series, The Voluntarist. I'm not too familiar with the comic book industry or how that works, but I'm kind of just curious, as somebody who, in my case, personally reads mostly, nonfiction, I'm curious how you would take something such as The Voluntarist, which clearly has, an allegorical aspect to it as well, which seeks to convey some type of message beyond just the literal characters, but make an actual message about society. I'm curious what your writing process would be for that, and what you hope to accomplish with writing this series.
Well, thank you. Yeah, when I started the series, it was just a way to kill time at first with preparing for my bar exam when I was, after I finished law school. And I had always wanted to do something creative in the liberty sphere. And so I was like, mulling around what I could do when I had some free time after studying. And so I started to work on a film script idea because I was a big fan of all the Marvel and DC movies that had come out in the years from, about the 2000s, up through 2012. And I was like, man, it'd be great if there could be something that was actually principled, in the zone. And I started to put together a movie script and flesh out some ideas about what that could look like, where it's an actual story, and it has normal themes in terms of telling a story and the hero and the motives, but to turn the narrative against the status norm, right, the status quo, because in every major production out there, pretty much when it comes to Hollywood or Amazon, Netflix, they assume the government is good, or if there's something wrong, it just needs to get rid of the few bad apples, right? There's nothing that's meaningfully challenged about the nature of government. Virtually always, even if it's a story about human freedom, the government's going to be viewed as inherently good or necessary. So I wanted a story that didn't have that as the backdrop. And that was it. It's like, it's just doing something new that really hasn't been done meaningfully, I think, before, at least in the comic genre and certainly in the superhero genre. So when I was working on the movie script, I eventually realized that, it's just going to be too hard to do that without a big budget. I don't want it to be hokey, but I was like, I like comics and I like superhero stuff. So what about doing a comic book instead? I'm like, that actually seems like it's more affordable to do right, at least, in the alternative comics industry, to do it, with competitive design and style. So I was like, okay, that seems more attainable to do it that way instead of trying to be too big at first. So I switched the scripting format toward working on a comic series, and I ended up really enjoying it because I enjoyed working with the artwork aspects and being creative that way and actually having something to show for it. And of course, in the process, comic books are basically storyboards anyway. So when you make a comic book, you're setting yourself up. If you want to make an animated movie or a live action adaptation, you already kind of have the bare bones to it. So I thought that was a win-win no matter what. Doing the comic book series would both please me with the storytelling and the aesthetics, and then give me something to work from for the future if I could grow it to that size and scale. So I continued grinding it out, and then I raised money to do a first prototype edition, and that didn't go as well as hoped in terms of reaching my goals. But I didn't stop. I kept trying and growing and working on things and coming up with some futurist prototypes to do some insider humor and raise funds and give me more time to work on the script and to flesh out some characters. And eventually I got really serious. And I was like, okay, I gotta create a canon origin story. And so a little over 6 years ago, I created the origins story, the first issue, and ran with that and was relatively successful. In the past several campaigns of the origins campaigns, 5+ years, I raised well over 100% of goal and successfully funded all the comics. And even just recently, the last campaign we did, which is for this Origins trade paperback remaster. We actually remastered the series and did a full wrap trade paperback. It looks beautiful. So I'm very proud of it. But in that process, I was able to fix some things from the past issues because we had a company that we were working with that went defunct. And so we had some art issues and continuity issues. And I was able to go back, fix it all, get everything into uniform design, get everything perfectly spaced and bubbles, be proud of it because I lettered it myself. And now I have an amazing Origins arc where I have both that trade paperback and these 6 Origins issues, in the single format. And it's excellent. I really am proud of it. As before, I was a little bit shaky on it, a little bit ashamed of just the growing pains and trying to fix things and having to deal with poor companies, unfortunately. Part of that process was getting things back in my own hands and just getting quality control back in my hands. But now everything is in my hands, and I feel really good about both what we've done with the remaster and now on our next campaign. The next arc is called Suit Saga 1, which is currently funding on Indiegogo. And at this point, when I checked this morning, it's 88% funded. So we're nearing 100% funding on that already. And this is the fastest we've ever done so, actually, in all of our history. We still have, I think around 40-ish days to go on the campaign, maybe a little under that. So we're doing very well, time-wise on that campaign. So it's very exciting, very exciting times for independent creators, and especially like myself, where I'm doing something that otherwise would never get any play in the mainstream, right? I mean, who wants to have a comic book series that challenges statism as part of its core backdrop? Again, it's not a preachy comic. It's not some like, oh, here's how to learn about voluntarism or anything. Not at all. It's actually just a regular story, but I do things that are just different in terms of what norms are assumed. And because of that, it might be a little shocking to some people in the process, just reading it, but it's not shocking in a way where it's like preaching you or telling you something what to do. It's just more the character concepts and troubling situations they face, deal with things that you would never otherwise see. You know what I mean? You would never otherwise get to have a comic series meaningfully talk about, self-ownership, consent, and things like that. So
I think you do touch on a very profound point there when you say that, comic books, essentially don't really present government or the state in a particularly negative light. They often tend to romanticize it as a concept. They try to present it as some type of heroic, noble entity, whereas, the type of ideas that we align with, libertarianism, anarchism, these ideas are actually, if anything, seem to be vilified or seen as, I guess vilified would be the perfect word in the context of comic books, but yes, in short, I do think it is definitely something that the comic book industry desperately needs for these types of ideas to be, presented. Because as we know, the public relations major in me really does, respect, that you are putting a message out through the comic book medium, something that seems to be very popular now. Like you're saying, with basically all the movie industry right now is practically consumed by superhero movies at the time. And another aspect that I've also seen in our society that has a lot of influence and sway is hip-hop music in particular. And I do see that you've also have made quite a name for yourself in that area as well. So for that, I'm very curious how you were able to get into such an interesting field in that case, how you got into that, and what your process for creating hip-hop music would be in terms of libertarianism.
Yeah, sure. So, we've put together quite a few songs, me and my wife, the philosopher, over the years. And I didn't directly study these things in terms of it being a part of my major. I wasn't some, audio engineer or, doing something in production. It was always more so tangential to my interest in a self-directed thing. I learned a lot about production, just kind of playing with studio setup equipment. And then, of course, myself engaging with it, doing some film production things, and then voice acting in an Xbox 360 game, and doing some voiceover acting when I was younger. So, a mixture of things, self-directed and just using audio equipment, kind of brought me together to an understanding of how to get music production done. And my wife really wanted to do some music. She loves karaoke and loves singing. So I was like, all right, we got to do something with this. So we first did a parody song of John LaJolie. So we did this song called Show Me Your Principles, which is a parody of his song, Show Me Your Genitals, which our song's a little bit more about ethics and economics in kind of a comedy way. And that was just kind of a playful thing. We did that with our own equipment, nothing too crazy. But eventually she's like, yeah, okay, let's really do a song. I'm like, yeah, let's really do one. So we did ANCAP Grind. That was our first big production that we did together. So I wrote that song and I licensed the music from a third party and put that all together. We practiced it, record the song in studio. And what we usually do is we usually get the song down right at home on our own musical systems in terms of practice. And then we take it to studio so that when we go to studio, we're just not wasting time. We want to make sure that, because studio costs a lot of money. So we want to make sure that we're making the most of our studio time. So when we go in as you know, as far as we've always done, we hammer it out, bang it out in one session. We're always able to complete our whole song in just one studio recording session because we're so good at having everything set up in practice beforehand. So once we had that song, we decided to do the music video. So we worked with another third party that was a music video production company. I worked as producer on that first big, music video production. I set up the staging for what would be our scenes and locations with them. I did the costuming. I did a lot of the custom props for that. So I would, paint the shoes that she wore. I custom produced a shirt that she wore. I had various props and jewelry that I custom made, and I did all the wardrobe and stuff like that. So that's part of the producer role aspect. And then that video ended up doing pretty well in the Liberty world, considering. I think on YouTube it has like 85 or 86,000 plays alone. It's been ripped by other people too, and people have played it, shared it elsewhere. So it has a lot more plays than that, just because people are taking it, using it in different things, and it's appeared on other platforms. But that was pretty fun and pretty big for us, who it's just a ragtag team of Liberty lovers. We're not doing this through some big production company. We don't have a distribution group. It's just us recording it and submitting it and hoping that we key tag it well enough that people see it. So all things considered, not too bad. And we continued to do music after that because we just enjoyed it so much. And at this point, I think we have something like 20 songs recorded and several high quality music videos since then. We actually just finished our latest one, Break the Great Reset. We shot that in the summer and released it in October. And that was a really fun one. She has some great costuming there. And we have a cameo with Klaus Schwab. I did the custom outfit for him. He has these little patches that say "Eat the Bugs" and "World Economic Plunder" and "New World Order." So I custom made those, little things like that, just to make it fun. And we're really proud of what we've made. And, we keep trying to get our music out there. And we do have independent distribution, the Repost Network, on something like 30 plus platforms with the music. But as always, we have faced many hurdles because we have been targeted at different points by agencies, both in the corporate and government zones, trying to suppress our work and silence our work. We were part of the targeting for the different groups back in 2016, 17, with trying to stop what was, this crazy burgeoning movement of Liberty people. I mean, if everyone remembers, post Trump, those in the media and the government got really scared, not because Trump was a meaningful threat, but because basically they saw their grip on everyone being loosened, and suddenly people were sharing taxation as death memes everywhere, and it was suddenly going really popular. And there was this huge populist movement for liberty leading up until 2019, with the Epstein situation, and then of course the government found their way to try to shut everything down with all the global chaos and the people rebelling through the lockdowns and shutdowns. So we try our best to get our stuff out there. We try workarounds and multiple platforms and everything, but it is definitely still tough. It's still a hurdle sometimes to try to break through some of the algorithmic censorship. But we keep rocking it, and we have a good time with it. And the music that we produce often relates some liberty message. We are getting out of that as well, like into other topics for fun, but we always stay true to those messages and those principles and try to incorporate that where we can.
And I did see those pictures of you in the Klaus Schwab costume. I personally thought those were just AI when I first saw them, but in any case, I do certainly appreciate the attention to detail there. And going back earlier to mentioning the Voluntarist comic, I did mean to ask, I do see a lot of similarities between this series as a concept, as well as Eric July and his concept of the Rippaverse, I believe he calls it. He has his series ISOM, and I'm kind of curious, what your relationship is with Eric July. I'm curious how close you two are, or if you work in conjunction with each other in any way.
Yeah, so me and Eric July don't have any type of material business or any type of that relationship. We're more acquaintances than anything, although, obviously back in the day, there was certainly a lot more conversations and stuff going on with the work that I did when I was with Anarchy Ball. There was for a brief period where both me and the philosopher were producing a little bit of content on being libertarian. In fact, one of their most viewed videos that they had was her video, the taxation of death video, that had over 4 million views on their channel back when their channel didn't even have 400,000 followers. And then they lost that channel earlier this year, I believe, that had about 1 million followers. So, but yeah, we certainly have, I would say, recognition of each other's work, and certainly I love what he's doing. Have always been a fan since his early days, doing Backwards and other things like that. I think we've been fairly big supporters of him in that way, and have promoted both his music and, of course, his comic venture now too. So his comics are definitely not in the zone that I'm in. I'm actually in a completely separate category. So in a lot of ways, we're not even really competing that way in a business sense, because his comic books don't have as much the on the face philosophical aspects to it. He definitely designed his comic book series to be a bit more broad audience. He's like a teen plus arena. I have more graphic violence and language. I don't do like graphic sexual stuff in my comic, but I certainly have stuff that would make it, a bit of a different age demographic and maturity demographic than he does for his, which again, he's doing his because, it's a smart way to do business. If you want to have your widest audience possible, it's, just like with PG-13 versus R-rated movies, if you have R-rated, that will cut down on who is going to be able to go see it, kind of thing. So I don't care. My goal with my comics was always to be more of a mature audience's style comic, just like a Watchmen or V for Vendetta or The Boys or Invincible. Those are definitely some of my favorite comic book series that I've read. So it was always meant to be a little bit, different that way. But over time, I've definitely had lots of fun experiences doing crossover things with some, elements of his team, like Igor Teixeira, which I always butcher his name because it's hard to say in Portuguese. But so he actually did the cover for my first nonfiction book. He was actually the artist on that, and he's Rippaverse's lead graphic design artist. And he also did the cover for my 6th issue. So I got him to do that before Rippaverse took him on full time. And he actually has a special campaign item on my latest Voluntarism campaign. There's a limited edition cover that's an Origins 2 cover variant that he did there too. So talented guy, love that guy. He's great. And, I was sad that I, couldn't work with him anymore because he's very fortunately for himself full-time with the Rippaverse. And I'm just very proud of him and his work and what the Rippaverse is doing. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Supported all his campaigns so far and will continue to because I'm also a comic fan. So it's awesome. And his team otherwise is very friendly with me, what I do. I love what they do and definitely promote them. And, to the point that even me and the Philosopher, we did a song called Rippaverse Taken Over. So we did a little rap song in celebration of his success. So that was a lot of fun to do.
What I am definitely getting from this is that even if your work may not be exactly side by side, you seem to at least be brothers in arms in a sense. But what I am kind of curious about, what I'm getting here is, so how did you get into libertarianism in the first place? I'm kind of curious, how long you've been in the libertarian movement, because from what I'm hearing from you, it seems to be that you've been in this for a long time. I don't know if you came from a libertarian household. I myself came from a very non-political family and kind of just came to it of my own accord, and basically through also growing up alongside a lot of other, sometimes anarchists, in school, and different thinkers such as that helped me to essentially get to that idea. I don't know if you had a similar trajectory.
Yeah, I didn't come from a libertarian household. My parents, for most of my formative years, especially in my early teen arena and later, they were neoconservatives. So, evangelical right. And I definitely kind of adopted that just by the nature of people, we were around and associated with. It wasn't until later that I had my worldviews challenged in college. And, college for me in my history class, did the first leg of opening me up to thinking through things. And it wasn't because my college was like teaching me, Mises or anything. It was more so just a history class talking about the American eugenics movement, with the case of Buck v. Bell, where Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes forced her to be sterilized because he said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And so he, wanted to have her no longer be able to reproduce. And it was just hearing about that story and being totally shocked by it because it was never taught to me before. It's like, wait, what? I thought this happened in Germany, not in America, this whole eugenics thing. And that started my path of looking at what it was that the government actually was and did. And a part of that was looking at a lot of Alex Jones's content over the time. So between like 2005-ish to around 2007, I was moving my way from neoconservative to libertarian. And then from about 2008 to 2010 was when I was moving my way from libertarian to voluntarist. So I've technically been, libertarian for well over 15 years, at this point, definitely 17 years at least. But, it's something that worked with me over time. It took years to go from neoconservative to paleoconservative, to big L libertarian to small libertarian to voluntarist by helping myself remove a lot of the excuses I had for statism. It took a lot of undoing my programming to get there. So I definitely have been around for a long time. And, I'm not like the oldest by any measure. I definitely have met libertarians who have been libertarians for 50 years and stuff like that. But I certainly am a bit more seasoned than the typical libertarian. And that is simply because it was people like me and a number of others between the Ron Paul campaign phases and a little bit thereafter, between Ron Paul and Trump, who did a lot of the heavy lifting of making libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism, voluntarism mainstream. So without people like me and, there's others in this type of circle, I think of Jason Bassler and Free Thought Project and people, of course, like Eric July and being libertarian, without people in this zone who took these ideas out of this kind of nerdy academic kind of enclave and turn it into a cultural phenomenon, you wouldn't have the number of people that you have today who are libertarians, because we did things to change minds in very engaging and unusual ways that you could with the internet and ways you couldn't do before with viral media. And so, up till that point, your biggest people within libertarian thought would be like Ayn Rand because of her because of her fiction, with Atlas Shrugged, or Milton Friedman in his Free to Choose series, and Ron Paul, of course, being kind of the biggest thing to make some waves with his 2008 and 2012 campaigns. So, but, before that modern internet era where, you really have mass media, you can have people with cell phones taking videos and being able to meaningfully upload those, not, 2004, but, 2010 post, before you had that mass media opportunity, it was very rare to see anybody engage with these types of ideas and on the level they are today, where people are talking about ANCAPs, libertarianism, and abolishing the ATF and saying taxation is theft. So it's a ever evolving process. Obviously, each person, each generation is standing on the shoulders of giants before them. I certainly am. I learned a lot from people who are much more impressive than I've accomplished so far. And so I'm just trying to reach for the stars myself and do my own heavy lifting, after those who helped change my mind and educate me, did for me, kind of thing. So, now, of course, I'm a bit more seasoned. I got some gray hairs. And so now I'm no longer the baby libertarian voluntarist. And I'm, now a multi-published nonfiction author and have a lot of different things, that I've done. So I'm a bit more of the seasoned old guy, even though I don't really look it, which is, sometimes that comes with the territory, is that when you don't look as old compared to other people are just like, oh, who's this nobody? They're just a baby. So I've definitely dealt with that. And other people do too, of course. I'm sure you can relate there sometimes, and people just think you look young, but you don't know what you're talking about. And that, comes with the territory. That's why sometimes it's a bit easier to be someone who's got a beard that's a little gray and be taken as, oh, you're old and you're wise just because of your looks, even if you're completely stupid, right? Just because you look that way, like, oh, they must be wise, But and we know, philosophically, it's not gray hairs that make one's character or wisdom. It's how they interpret and internalize their ethical philosophy and do so in a way that leads to peace through property rights and non-initiation of violent force. So.
Right, exactly. I do know that there is a movement through the United States, to say raising the voting age, but I'm personally a bit ambivalent on that anyway, since I think voting in itself is not the answer to the problems that society is currently facing. And I would say, if anything, they should try to create some type of system that best rewards people by more of an actual metric outside of age, or something that actually applies to their own intelligence. Perhaps obviously, I would ideally prefer some type of anarchist answer to this, some type of answer without a state to begin with. But if we had to have voting, at least one step in the right direction would be, I would say, something of a civics test, I think it would at least help with well, a lot of the more illegitimate aspects of our current democratic process. But basically, I noticed you were speaking there about, Ron Paul's runs in 2008 and 2012. These were things that, I was, fairly young during those elections, and I do recall him being fairly popular as well. I had not heard of libertarianism as an ideology prior to that point, and this is somebody who was close with Murray Rothbard as well. He was very deeply engaged in the Austrian circles. So basically, um, what is your estimation of what he really accomplished in those campaigns? What do you think, really prevented him from taking off? Do you think that it was basically the state getting in the way, essentially, preventing him from reaching his full potential there? Or do you see it as some type of an indictment of the, American public really for just not being willing to accept those types of ideas?
Ron Paul was fine. That wasn't the issue. The issue actually was very specific and known, and that was that the Republican Party committed acts of fraud, or I should say, defrauded their base by doing unscrupulous things to try to keep Ron Paul from getting on the floor at the convention. They had people that were, essentially trying to block speakers and delegates. There was some issues I remember, I think even in New Hampshire. I got to refresh my memory because it's been a while since I've had to look at these issues. We're talking near 10 years at this point. But basically people trying to manipulate votes for delegate votes and things like that. There was a lot of internal problems with the Republican Party intentionally trying to stop Ron Paul, despite him having enough weight to possibly get the nomination. So I think that was actually the number one issue, was that Ron Paul was not stopped by the general American electorate or even necessarily the government outright. He was stopped by the Republican internal establishment, and they did everything they could to try to stop him from succeeding at getting the delegate count up enough to make it. So that's just the basic brass tacks to that.
Right, yes. And this is a trend that has certainly continued since then. We've been hearing, basically every election there are some, allegations of fraud related to it. And while some people see this as something that really, angers them, I, in a perverse sort of way, am actually thrilled to see these allegations of election fraud because it's showing that people are beginning to grow more and more disenfranchised with this democratic process. The way I see it, I don't think at this rate, there may not be another election where people simply accept the results, and see them as a fair and honest election. This may become a new trend going forward where each president who wins is accused of winning illegitimately. And I think that if this trend continues, that is something that, while obviously a very dishonest and horrible, thing to do. I mean, it is flat out treason. It is something that could at least bring people to closer to libertarianism or closer to an anarcho-capitalist worldview if we can't trust our elections. I've often said, voting with your dollar accomplishes a lot more than voting with your ballot. So yes, I do see that as a long-term, it could potentially be a long-term positive. But in the meantime, obviously, it is very much a problem, and it has been, an instrument used to create, tyrannical measures, really. But getting off of that, speaking, about the voluntarist movement, I do know that you've written nonfiction, as in addition to your fiction. So basically, this is an area where I'm a bit more familiar with. This isn't such foreign territory to me. So you've written work such as The Definitive Guide to Libertarian Voluntarism, as well as A Vision for a Libertarian Future. And I do believe that you published a third book recently. Is that correct? Yes.
Yes, that is correct. Philosophical Voluntarism. That's my latest book, and it follows the same kind of format where it's a nice, neat, compact book, about 100 pages, and there's citations, and of course, just quick digested philosophy in a way that's very accessible, just as neatly as I could possibly make it for people, where they could read it and really understand it, apply it. Maybe they have to sit back and think about it for a moment, but something that anyone could read on a lazy Saturday or Sunday and think through the issues and dwell them for the rest of the week and really internalize them. So Philosophical Voluntarism has some crossover topics between the two books, but it is actually a philosophy 101 primer. So it takes you through the fundamentals of philosophy, some basics, almost like a philosophy 101 class you get at college, but in a more accessible way that helps you walk through and think about what is the nature of existence, what does it mean to find truth? What does it mean to think rationally? All those types of things. So I cover those in a way that I think is very difficult for anyone to outright reject. It would take a lot of performative contradictions and hypocrisies to reject what I write in there, because I make it so personally relatable, and I avoid any type of mystical abstractions. I don't put anything about natural law or it's from God or anything like that. It's purely about empathetic experience. What you experience as a person. So it doesn't matter what background you come from. It's just think about yourself. Think about how it is that you act. Think about how you want to be treated by others. That kind of thing. So it's a bit more universally applicable. And so I think that anybody could read this, doesn't matter what background they come from. They could understand it and start to be like, oh, okay, I can see how that would apply in my life and why I'd want to actually live that way. So, and then it puts it into context into some short forms, applying it in different areas, like with parenting, business, and personal relationships. And, as I do with all my books, I put in there further reading. So where there's topics that it's like, it deserves its own book, I say, here's the next author to read about this. Like, for example, on nonviolent communication, I recommend Marshall B. Rosenberg, for example, and that's its own specialized set of tools to help people improve their lives. So I give people the brass tacks. I give people my own thoughts in a unique and novel way. I'm not someone who's just copying and pasting the words of others. I don't really care for that myself. I prefer to hear someone's individually articulated thoughts, unless it's an encyclopedia or something. So everything in there is written from my bent and my framing, and developed from my own unique philosophical vantage. But then I also include their further reading so that person can grow in their economic and ethical thinking.
So, as far as whether or not one considers themselves an objectivist, I do believe that objectivism, as far as its metaphysics, can provide a good foundation for a lot of the philosophy that we use in libertarian law. Libertarian legal theory, for example, the whole idea of respecting individual private property. I think that if we look at the actual metaphysics as laid out in certain objectivist works, perhaps in Leonard Peikoff or Ayn Rand herself, although I do disagree with with a lot of the politics that Ayn Rand herself espoused, I do think that there is something to extract from that. And there are other origins as well throughout history that we can point to as origin points for libertarian thought. John Locke is one name that comes to mind, for example. But basically, what I'm kind of curious about here is, so basically, if you had to lay out the very philosophical foundations of libertarian legal theory, what would that be? As somebody, who, such as yourself, who studied law extensively, how would you make an argument for libertarian legal theory specifically?
Ooh, that's a really good one, because what's kind of funny is that that's actually the topic of my next book, is libertarian legal theory. And part of why I wanted to do that, obviously it makes sense because I actually have a Juris Doctor, I have a law degree. So, if I'm going to talk about something, it makes more sense for me to talk about something that's really a point of expertise. You know what I mean? Obviously I didn't get a PhD in molecular biology, so me talking about molecular biology might not be as exciting to people, no matter how much I might have studied independently about it. The fact that I don't have the credentials on paper is, it makes it less exciting. But if I talk about legal theory, well, I actually do have those credentials. So I wanted to do that, and actually in part because Stefan Kinsella is also working on his legal theory primer. He collected what amounts to about 800 pages of all of his writings, and he's formatting it into a legal theory primer. And a part of that too was actually me and him debating ideas. So his development of his book and a bit of drive there in the process was me and him debating over some ideas, because I love the guy and I think he's amazing. So that will, of course, entail that there might be some distinguishing aspects between me and him in legal theorizing. We have a lot of shared stuff, absolutely, but I think I have a little bit just marginally different or additional framings that he doesn't have. And one of those ties to contractual theory, for example, and he ties his ideas a bit to the Rothbardian theory of title theory, which is this idea that a contract is really about exchanging title. If you have money and you have an apple, you're giving title to the money to the person who has the apple. Apple now goes to the person, and the other person now has title to the apple, that kind of thing. But I think there's applications for contracts go outside of just purely exchanging titles. But I'll say that for another topic. We'll go to the root, which is libertarian legal theory basis. So on that note of property rights and title theory, the libertarian theory is rooted in property rights, right? When we're talking about libertarian legal theory, everything begins with the concept of property. Because in order to have a type of judiciable legal claim here, you have to have something that involves property rights and either the violation thereof or the exchange thereof, right? So that's what we're mainly thinking about when it comes to legal theory and dealing with disputes over those things, whether it's intentional or accidental. So libertarian legal theory is wholly revolved around the topic of property rights. That's what it's about, whether it's something that is a criminal harm, someone steals from another, that's taking their property, a civil harm, someone trips and falls and hits their body into theirs, and because they touched or struck the other person, they didn't consent to that and they got a bruise, there's a injury there against their bodily property. Or contracts, right, where someone says they're going to give over money and they perform this service, like they fix someone's roof and they don't do it, right? That person was supposed to hand over title to the material used to create the roof, in exchange for that money, and put that together. And so there's a dispute there. So libertarian legal theory is solely revolving around those things. And to distinguish it from the statist paradigm of legal theory, the statist paradigm has this abstraction, of course, called harms against the state, right? So the state is considered the party that is bringing charges, by the prosecution. That's why you often see when it comes to criminal cases, it says the state versus whoever, John Doe, right? It's not the victim who's doing this, it's the state. So that creates a lot of problems because the state comes up with all kinds of laws that don't actually involve the harm against someone's discrete body of property. For example, banning cannabis possession or consumption, where someone has the property right to the leaf and they have it in their home and no one else's property rights being violated. But the government says, oh, well, if you have this plant, we will throw you in a cage. So that's a big problem. So that would definitely delineate the statist legal paradigm from the libertarian legal paradigm order. And ultimately, what we're discussing here when we're talking about kind of what I'm going to be presenting, which is going to take a little bit more time too, because I might flesh or bounce a little more off Kinsella, but also what he's creating is this backdrop foundational philosophy. Because at the end of the day, you need to have that in a conceptualized form. You can have market law. In other words, you can have law organically arise through people wanting to come together and agree for the sake of facilitating trade. I mean, absolutely. But market law in and of itself does not inform philosophy. Right. And I think that's a pretty big distinction that I think probably pits me in some ways against other people like Friedman and even to some degrees Rothbard, if you're looking at it from a purely consequentialist outcome. And the reason why, and I talk a bit about this in my book, that at least some of the stuff that I've already written for it, is that you could have a market in chattel slavery, right? There's free market incentives with selling human beings. Now, if you don't have a robust concept of self-ownership and property rights, right, you can rationalize that. Well, okay, well, these are darker skinned people, and so they don't have bodily property rights, so we can sell them. And now, see, there's a free market in slaves. So yeah, you have to have an underpinning philosophy that informs your legal norms, whether they're private market or to transition metered through the state. And maybe the state, as I say in a Vision for Libertarian Future, the ideal situation is to get taxation down to as little as possible, to the point that maybe it becomes non-existent entirely, and getting those functions into market means. Essentially the government moving toward a market order. So you still need those philosophical backdrops. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter if you have law by the state or private market law. If you rationalize theft and murder, what good is it? It doesn't really help anybody in the end if a group of people's like, well, we'll have a market in murder, but you can only murder these people, right? And say you can buy contracts for murder. It doesn't make any philosophical sense, but it's possible. It's not that the problem is it's not an impossibility. And we know this from history. Human history is littered with these types of things. We're not talking about an abstraction that's only metaphysical. We well know that there are black markets, red markets, in murder contracts. We know that governments will come with laws and oppress people over victimless activity. So it's not speculative. So we need this framework for people to adopt and to apply and employ in their thinking in all areas. And without that, of course, we do have chaos as always. It's just a matter of how much chaos we end up with, and we're trying to get as little violent chaos as possible. And The only way you're going to get there is by having a consistent philosophy that backdrops the outcomes to this dispute resolution. So it's definitely what Kinsella is looking to do. It's definitely what I'm looking to do. And I hope that, when we have our respective works come out, that it's edifying and people find it useful to thinking about how market and or transitional government legal orders could shift to become more proprietarian.
What you were touching on there also reminds me, it makes me think of Walter Block's voluntary slave contract, that whole theoretical idea. Now, that is something that I'm personally opposed to. And basically, my reasoning behind it is that as an anarchist, as an anarcho-capitalist, I've often heard many communists, many socialists trying to essentially trick anarcho-capitalists into saying basically that what they endorse is in fact the same thing as the state, that these private corporations or private businesses or just private property rights in the first place are no different than a government. So I would say that the primary distinction that truly sets these things apart is the fact that under our libertarian values, you cannot own the actual person, you cannot actually own another person. Whereas I would say, in order for somebody who's a statist to argue that, let's say, taxation is somehow not theft, in order for you to argue that that money that you're taking through tax money is your property, you would essentially have to already establish that the person you're taking the tax money from is your property to begin with. So it's like, so if they're your property, then that money is your property by extension. So I would say that is just an implicit part of any statist society. So my issue with, Block's voluntary slave contract is that you're essentially breaking that one distinction. You're essentially melding that lines, and you are essentially allowing through potential means of, somebody potentially taking the property of another person, they could potentially tax them. And I think you are essentially leaving the door open for, some pretty severe authoritarianism if a sneaky enough person were to get in the way. But that's basically just my personal take on the voluntary slave contract.
Yeah, and I would actually like to piggyback on that. I actually specifically debunk Block, very much intellectually so, just not from just some utilitarian point. So it's not simply ethically wrong, but it's also philosophically impossible. And I explain this in my book. So when this idea of a voluntary slave contract is nonsense, because to own a person, right, means that you are the highest claimant to their body and that someone else doesn't have a right to the control of that body. And so I make this comparison to someone who's trying to sell a car, right? Imagine, you're looking to buy a car from somebody, and when you do your transaction, like, okay, here's the money, here's the term, blah, blah. Okay, all right, I get this car, you got the money, good. And then you're like, great, all right, I got the keys, and you go to get into the driver's seat. But the person who just sold you the car is still sitting in it. All right. So you're like, hey, you sold me this car, but you're not getting out of the driver's seat. What's going on? Right? How are you using this car if you're still asserting the claim and being in the driver's seat? Right. So that is essentially what's happening in a voluntary slave contract, which is not really, voluntary. It's happening in any chattel situation. The human being who is their consciousness is occupying the body, is exerting brain impulses on the body, that contradicts the ownership claim over, against the person that supposedly has it. It's actually a contradiction in the hierarchy. And so there is no transfer that can actually take place unless someone's dead. So if you have someone and they're dead, yes, you can have the whole body in death because their brain's no longer exerting impulses on it to the, contradicting their claim. In the same way that if you were to own an animal, right, someone who believes that you have the private rights to an animal, you have the right to end that animal's life and cut that animal up and eat it. Right? Unlike a human. So it's very important to think through these things in the specifics of what is taking place and what's actually happening. And you have to walk through at the base property rights analysis. Otherwise, you'll come up with some really ridiculous things like voluntary slave contract, which is totally bogus, and it doesn't actually represent what is taking place in empirical reality, which is the person has not actually given up control of their body. It's an illusory contract. You have not given up yourself to that other person's full control. You're still enacting control against the will of the other. So it's just an impossibility at a bare minimum. It's just a logical impossibility until death. And that also makes sense in other cases as to why there's other ways you can alienate parts, right? When you think about someone who is donating blood, you're able to take the blood away from your body's control and give it to someone else. If you donate plasma, same thing. An organ, you can alienate that body part from the control of your brain impulses and give it to another, and that becomes an extruded property right. But you cannot do that in whole, the whole person, chattel slavery, until death. And at that point, of course, you could donate your body to science, or if somebody wants to use it for something weird, I don't even know. But again, it's your body. You could say, after I die, in consideration of this much money, you could have my body for science or whatever else. But until then, no, it's your brain is acting in contradiction of those property rights. And so that's kind of some of the things that I deal with when I talk about these issues, and I distinguish myself philosophically and in a scholarly way from some of these past thinkers. And again, a lot of these people are great thinkers. Block is, they certainly don't have, I think, everything completely fleshed out in a consistent way. And so that's where I step in some of these places to try to help bring some clarity to these things and make it more uniform and consistent within the proprietarian rights theory.
I've often thought that, the freedom to get rid of your freedom does not advance the cause of freedom to begin with. And moreover, I've often heard, some people in favor of, the idea of voluntary slavery, saying that, for example, people will sign a contract to perform a certain job or a certain task. And in that case, once they sign that, they are, obligated to essentially go along with that task. It's just that task might have a certain limited amount of time or certain parameters, whereas the voluntary slave contract simply takes those parameters and extends them to be practically permanent in this case. But first of all, what I see as a false equivalency with this particular type of contract that they're referring to is that these contracts have escape clauses to begin with. So there's still not an actual requirement that that they're absolutely forced to perform these certain tasks. It's just that if they don't, then there's they could pay a certain fee in some case. There could be some type of other arrangement that could be worked out in its case. So I just think legally there's not even that much basis for, for any type of precedent for a voluntary slave contract to begin with. Going beyond that, though, I guess to venture more into your personal life, you are, married to the philosopher, and, you two are both pretty much considered one of the more prominent libertarian power couples at this time. So in that case, just, out of curiosity, how exactly does a relationship between two of the foremost libertarians out right now, how does that really function? How do you think, your beliefs particularly influence your relationship?
Yeah, so the things that I think take the most from in terms of our views and our relationship is that we try to apply the nonviolent communication and seeking for peaceful resolution methods, I would say, in our relationship. It's not, of course, always perfect. Certainly, there's times that I act either in anger or impatience, and vice versa. But it's something that we do try to apply whenever we have conflict or we're trying to work out different types of insecurities or states of being triggered, that kind of thing, reactions to trauma. So we definitely have that aspect in mind. We definitely have discussions about philosophical things when it comes to libertarian ideas, absolutely. But otherwise, we live life and we have good times and family and hanging out with kids, who are our relatives and things like that. So, it certainly is something that informs how we treat each other and how we try to talk with each other. And it's very powerful and, of course, very changing for one's mindset. I would say the focus of trying to find connection first and trying to bring that back, with everything you do, is important, because sometimes it can be easy to get into a myopic focus of being upset or justified or angry. And sometimes it's easy to lose focus on that, you love the person, you want to, connect them and hear them out and understand. So balancing that is always something that, we bring to the table from the rest of our philosophical thoughts and the communication tactics that we try to espouse. So yeah, I would say, it's all encompassing and certainly is a part of everything that we do. And it's a constant growth process. It's, constantly me trying to learn more about myself and how to be better at listening or communicating. And I think she would say the exact same thing, in terms of that.
For me personally, I'm somebody who tends to put, who tends to be more focused on work and, creating and making output such as that I don't really, in my own personal life, I don't really get too involved in the romantic realm. But I know there might be some listeners out there who, who may consider themselves to be staunch libertarians and may be struggling in that area. And, I'm just kind of curious, what exactly they should look for, what exactly be the best possible, you know, the best possible alteration to their mindset that they could possibly make in finding the right person.
Yeah, well, I think that the first step to find the right person is working on oneself, right? You have to be someone who's worth being with. And so if if you don't start to, in the proverbial sense, with Jordan Peterson, not that I'm really drawing this from, I just think it's kind of funny, clean your room, not really, in that direct literal sense. Of course, if your room's dirty, you probably should clean it. But it's more so cleaning your own house. You got to take care of your own psychology and your own traumas and the way that you talk to others, the way that you process how, what someone else is saying and thinking. You have to do that effectively before you can have a good relationship. So you got to be someone who's worthwhile themselves, takes care of themselves mentally, physically, and emotionally. And if you do those things first, then you're going to have a much better time at finding somebody, because you will be better at having a genuine connection with them. Now, unfortunately, in this current world, we have a big difficulty because there's been a lot of broken relationships and divorce. And so we have a pretty hefty generation of childhood trauma that's come up. And on top of that, the schooling trauma is another nightmare. So it's very difficult to find somebody who doesn't have some baggage, to say the least, right? Between the potential baggage of trauma at home to the potential baggage of someone's situation in a schooled paradigm. So to that extent, you're going to have to find someone at a bare minimum, if you want a good relationship, who's focused on a growth mindset. You have to have someone who's open to having robust, intimate conversations and being comfortable with their emotions and talking through those things, who doesn't immediately shame you or put you down or call you names, label you, that kind of thing. That's very common, those types of behaviors, because they're modeled everywhere, right? Bullying in schools modeled everywhere. You watch TV shows, every TV show by and large runs off the slapstick or shaming humor, right? Putting somebody down, making fun of them, one-upmanship, that whole thing. So there's been a lot of dysfunctional modeling for people, and it is tough to find someone who's at least recognized that and it's like, okay, I want to work on myself, right? But if you could find someone who at least has those two things, they recognize the problem and they're like, and I want to work on it. Like they're genuinely wanting to be like, yeah, I want to be a better person. I want to know myself better. I want to work on my traumas and triggers, and I want to, have a good relationship. I want to be long-term oriented with somebody. Then you're in good shape, because nothing will ever be perfect relationships. There's always going to be something that comes up. But if you're with someone who's actively trying to be ethical and principled and grow, then you are in a much better position, than otherwise. And if you understand the red flags, if you know how to look for those things, then it'll be a bit easier to wean out the problem people, because there's going to be tons of different types of girls out there who are, or guys, potentially, who are just looking out for what their next move up is, right? They don't actually care about growing and fostering a relationship. They just want to, almost like a millennial in the workforce these days, leverage their way up from one relationship to the next, jumping up to the ladder, socioeconomic ladder, right? They're not looking to build and to grow over the long term. So you got to weed out girls or guys who are like that, who are just looking to immediately jump ship when they think they have something that could just be, that much better. So to try to make things, better with the relationship, at least that they wanted, or they said they wanted, if they're at that commitment level, not just casual dating, of course, you're just casual dating. You're free to jump ship wherever you want to go, of course. But if you get into a serious relationship and you're like, okay, yeah, I want to be with this person, and eventually make that commitment of wanting to be, however you do it. I mean, we didn't get married through this state, but we had a marriage ceremony, and certainly there's lots of people who are doing that these days, just wanting to have the commitment, but without the government involvement. So whatever it is, whatever stage we're about to be very serious about the relationship, you want to make sure that person is sharing that same growth mindset and is not in this constantly surveying to see where the grass is greener instead of watering their own proverbial grass by working on themselves and working on their communication, working on their habits, working on their physical and mental health, which are also very important. You know, you need someone who's willing to take care of themselves, because otherwise they won't be able to take care of those around them, right? If someone doesn't have good habits and patterns of behavior for their mental and physical health, that will be passed on to children, that will be passed on to, or the stress of that will be passed on to their partner at a bare minimum, right? So it's very important to have those things sorted, you know, before you get really locked down.
Yes. Self-interest, I would say, is certainly a virtue in terms of, pursuing relationships such as that. I often say, your parents may love you unconditionally, but that does not apply in the romantic realm, and nor should it, I would say. I would say that there's more value to it anyway. If somebody actually loves you for what you've accomplished with yourself and what you've made of yourself as well, rather than just them giving it to you, just for no particular reason, other than, in let's say in your parents' case, that they may be related to you. But in the romantic realm, I think that I would personally put more value on the idea of, being loved for what I've accomplished and what I've done. So basically, moving on, I guess, from the topic of marriage, essentially you're talking about, bearing children and all of that. I understand that's a massive responsibility as well, especially in this modern time as well. I want to state for the record too, I'm not one of those people who believes that the world is overpopulated or anything like that. But I do see a lot of disturbing trends as far as technology, socially, politically, that are currently going on in society that make me think that I feel, quite frankly, a lot of pity towards a lot of the children who are growing up at this time. And I'm curious for anybody out there who's currently raising young children, what do you think would be the best course of action they should take when raising their children? What should they keep in mind when trying to raise children in a more libertarian-friendly, environment?
Yeah, for me, I speak specifically to what the ultimate ethical parenting modes are, and of course, I can't speak with as much authority as people who have had their own kids and have applied this. So often, I have to point to other people who are doing this and say, hey, well, don't just believe me, look at this person, or, personally known contact person. But I do have some experience with young people directly, because I have worked as a juvenile defense attorney. I've been a public school teacher or state school teacher, substitute teacher, full-time high school and K-8 school, and tutoring company owner. So I have worked quite a bit with young people in unique ways that does at least give me an insight into a lot of what's going on in terms of the toxic tropes that happen with kids and the problems that can happen. So peaceful parenting and the unschooling ethos or mindset are kind of key here. And what I mean with peaceful parenting is that a parent looks to educate their children and give discipline within the realm of talking, reason, and restraint, or removing good things, as opposed to using threats, force, ultimatums, and hitting to achieve those aims. And so there's often this conflation that if you don't hit your kid, they'll just not be disciplined, this kind of thing with spanking. So it's a common misconception. Murray Strauss is a PhD researcher in this realm who studied the nature of spanking, corporal versus non-corporal punishment. And it's pretty abundantly clear at this point, no matter what way you cut it, whatever rationalization you want to use, that spanking does not produce the outcomes that people really claim it does. It just creates more trauma and more, negative outcomes, mentally, in terms of brain development and socially. And rather that if you just use repeated non-corporal punishment, you basically have the same discipline outcomes generally, in the end, if not better. That is that if you don't use means to hit kids, but you repeatedly use those methods in terms of nonviolent methods, you still get kids eventually to get it, basically. And parents will hit their kids, and the kids will still act in a way that they didn't like, and then be like, well, I'll hit them again, right? They don't look at the spanking and say, oh, well, I guess spanking failed. They will keep repeating those violent things and ignore the fact that it didn't work the first time. So it's just it's a mentality change, and it's not something that is too bizarre to look at these days. Not that I, like state intervention or anything like that, but again, I'm just trying to point to what is in reality. And Sweden, banned spanking in 1979. So, did Sweden then turn into, this Mad Max landscape, and kids are all in, roving street gangs because none of them were spanked? Like we expect, oh my gosh, they must all be violent and at each other's throats. It's like, no, parents just used other non-corporal punishment means to raise their kids. And that was that. That's basically what it boiled down to, right? So, there are ways to have parenting be effective and disciplined without resorting to hitting. And one of the guides I recommend, who's again peaceful parent and has kids, so don't just believe me. I try to point to people who are experts in this area and apply it. Dr. Laura Markham, she has kids. She's has a doctorate as well, and she applied her psychological expertise in studying peaceful parenting techniques and applying that. And then she wrote a great book on that to help parents know how to effectively use non-corporal punishment means to help get their kids to be more self-reflective and self-regulating. And then the unschooling aspect of things is this idea that you don't have kids forced into a one-size-fits-all compulsory curriculum. It's that kids should be free to learn with adults acting as facilitators instead of judges. In other words, adults are there to help kids with their interests, not to tell them, hey, you need to learn this, today, and it must be done by 4:00. And if you don't, have these reading skills by this age, and you're a failure, you're going to work at McDonald's, right? That old trope. So the unschooled mindset is just a paradigm shift in that realm. And kids who are treated well in this way don't become stupid. They don't not learn how to read. They just do it at their own pace, in their own context, and do so naturally because they want to engage in the world around them. And adults just act as facilitators of this. They just help them when they have questions or point them in a direction or give them resources. And so in this realm, kids can still read a textbook or take a class. It's just they elect to, they choose to. If a kid's like, I want to take a baking class, they can. If they want to take a programming class, they can. If they want to take a math class, they can. If they want to go to college, they can. They can study for the SAT and ACT. They can do all those things. It's just that it's not being forced on them, and they're not being told, hour by hour, you have to be studying this topic, then this topic. And if you don't turn your work by this time, you're a failure and you're just behind everybody. And it's, this whole shaming nonsense complex, goes away. And I think is something that's good, not just for those who are not great at academics and maybe they're more hands-on. It's great for academics too. If you're actually an academic, now you actually have the freedom to dive in deeper when you're actually more curious about things. You have the freedom to take classes that really mean something to you and to focus your studies. So it's a wonderful thing. And I think, again, pointing to other people who are well-credentialed in this area and who have applied this. I think Carrie McDonald, she has a master's degree from Harvard in educational policy. She's a Foundation for Economic Education fellow and scholar. She has her own 4 kids, so she's unschooled, and she actually spends her days studying alternative education and going and around the country and showcasing these things. So I recommend her book, Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. That is a great starting guide to understanding unschooling, seeing how it's applied in a bunch of different ways and means and manners, and giving yourself some tools to think about how you would do it for your own kids. So the end. Don't just believe me. I'm sorry I don't have kids. I have a lot of experience with kids, but I don't have kids. But look at these other scholars to start, and they will also lead you to other scholars and people who have applied these practices with their own kids. It's not a small thing. Peaceful parenting is certainly very widespread, and unschooling now didn't used to be as widespread, but it's definitely grown like a wildfire since the lockdown shutdowns, because suddenly a bunch of parents realized how bad the schooling system was. They got to see their kids and what they were bringing home and what their teachers were doing. They're suddenly like, oh, okay, I'm going to be taking it out of the school, right? So homeschooling, unschooling shot through the roof and has continued to maintain pretty steady hold with a lot of parents suddenly becoming privy to just how bad things were. So those are really, to me, the ultimate libertarian voluntarist manners for helping children become flourishing adults is unschooling, peaceful parenting.
A lot of these government public schools, are just complete disasters in some cases. Basically, what I find interesting, though, is if we're talking about schooling in a completely voluntary sense, though, as we know, young children, they tend to have very high time preferences. What kind of interests me is, if a young child would just prefer to take the easier way out, to essentially neglect their studies, what kind of incentive would we be able to provide for somebody with such high time preferences to get them to actually, pursue what's best for them in more of an educational and informative sense?
Well, what's best is subjective. Each person has their own individual path, interests, and journey. So the better question is which bureaucrat gets to decide what's best for this child and their personal journey of what they want to do with their lives? Because that's the mentality that is of the schooled mindset, right? We have the greatest socialist central plan you can imagine with public schools, which is also one of the 10 planks of communism. So I think that the mentality has to be divorced from that, where you're not thinking, oh, this kid has to be this certain thing or this certain thing in this time. Children who are treated with this type of respect and autonomy find their interests through exploration and through play, and become attuned to what it is that they are most interested in that process. And it could take different routes and different times for different people, because everyone is biologically different. Unlike what they show in schools, where like, oh yeah, everyone's must be the same thing in a year from each other. It's like, no, their brain development, physical development varies wildly across children. And I've certainly seen that myself working with, the K to 12 paradigm. So it's just important to recognize that if there is something genuinely wrong with a young person, where they seem shamed or they seem unmotivated about anything, then there might be something else to look at and what's underpinning that. Is there some type of dysfunction going on at home in communication? Is there some type of thing taking place for them where they feel shamed? Is there something that is a genuine health or mental health problem? Because there's always going to be people in the world who might have an actual disorder of sorts, right? There's definitely people with autism spectrum disorder. There's definitely people with, different types of depression issues that are genuinely chemical, due to a disorder. So, there's always going to be some type of outliers of people. You never know where there's something to investigate. But when we're talking about, by and large, most every child, you're not going to have a problem with them, with being free to learn, picking up the tools of the culture and growing and learning how to read and their numeracy, just by being free to engage in the world around them. Just learning how to play games and learning how to count for, deck building card games, and all this other stuff. It's truly incredible what young people will do when given the chance. And there's a great, I'd say, a TEDx talk about that by Sugatra Mitra, where he set up computers in a very poor Indian community, and the kids were just teaching themselves all kinds of stuff using the computers, and then the older ones are teaching the younger ones. I mean, it's just incredible to show that when you just give kids the freedom to play and tinker, they start to pick up stuff. I mean, it really is not very difficult to do. The kids are just a big sponge. Their brain is growing so fast, and they're trying to take everything in. And if you just give them the freedom to explore and really dive deep, everything else falls into place.
Okay, yes, that sounds like an interesting concept there. In fact, it almost sounds vaguely Austrian in a sense. It almost sounds as though it takes a praxeological approach, in the sense that, we're recognizing that, people are biologically wired differently. Not everybody thinks the same way. They're not exactly predictable. So we can't really just use a one-size-fits-all universally applied rule when approaching this measure. And I would agree that what you're saying here, would at least serve as a better means of approaching it that way. So basically, just to kind of summarize what we've been talking about as far as your work, what I have found about it is I do think it really functions well from a public relations perspective. I do respect the way that you communicate with your audience. I do believe that what we need to do is we need to meet people on their own territory, and this is to say that we need to come to them instead of expecting them to come to us. So, for example, if we organized a convention, at some center out there about anarcho-capitalism as the natural conclusion of argumentation ethics, not a lot of people are going to show up to this event, and those that do are already going to have a vested interest in this subject. So it would be more or less preaching to the people who are already converted, and in doing so, it wouldn't be likely to spread the message to more people or to become more commonplace in society either. So, for example, with a lot of the work you do here, comic books are certainly popular. The movie industry, as I'm sure you'll agree, is just inundated with superhero movies, like I was saying earlier. But, hip hop music as well, that has a wide audience, that dominates the music industry. That has an enormous influence over our modern culture, just in terms of our sensibilities. And I think using these different forms of media to, a more of a libertarian angle, I think could be a great way to approach this idea going forward. So moving on from there, I definitely want to talk about what's going on with libertarianism, currently in the world. And at this time, obviously, the foremost thing people are talking about in terms of libertarianism is Javier Milei becoming president of Argentina. And I personally have, I'm personally very happy about this turn of events. We know that Argentina was under the grip of Peronism, long ago, and still today, to an extent, is. Now, if Milei accomplishes nothing else, I hope that he'll at least be able to get people to stop associating Peronism with capitalism, because this is more of a corporate socialism, obviously not a stable economic system by any means, and unfortunately one that I think is all too similar to what we currently have in the US. I mean, as far as Argentina, they have one of the highest inflation rates in the world. I mean, I know that in 2022 it was at over 72%, and in 2023 it's approaching I may very well be over 100% at this point. And basically, I mean, this is a country that's been having trouble borrowing from its neighbors. It's defaulted on its debt 9 times, I know, over the past 2 centuries, which is exceptionally high. And so basically, when I see Javier Milei's success, I'm certainly surprised that he's been able to become president, but I'm not that surprised considering the current circumstances of Argentina. We've seen a lot of, wishy-washy, empty communist, socialist rhetoric, and obviously none of it's really gotten them out of this situation. So now we see a country that really has its back against the wall, essentially. Now we have somebody out here who's actually talking about bringing in some type of change. An anarcho-capitalist actually becoming the president of a country is completely unprecedented. But here we are, we're seeing it happen now in real time. And, I think that there are nothing but possible, positive benefits to come from this. And I'm kind of curious what your take on the situation is, how you're responding to this news, and what you think is your outlook for Argentina in the days ahead.
Yeah, so I think that Javier Milei is a great example of something I've talked about for a long time, which is that you don't get the needed change for liberty until the pain to stay the same outweighs the pain to change. So I've talked about this in so many different shows and so many different places. Sometimes it's hard for people to really get that, but I give lots of examples. Just like with the lockdowns and shutdowns, and people seeing these riders go around and destroy everything, and they try to call the police, like help. And they're like, nah, we're good. Enjoy your destroyed city, right? You need that level of horror for people to finally wake up and get uncomfortable, say, oh my gosh, what is going on? Like, what world am I in? So Argentina, as you aptly noted, is a place that has really gone down the tubes, right? The pain for them to stay the same definitely outweighed the pain to change. And it really took a lot of inflation, a lot of corruption to get there, unfortunately, but that is the nature of pain signals, right? When your body gives you a pain signal because you get a cut, it goes, ouch, don't do that. And if you don't have that from what is socialistic or democratic socialistic practices and cronyism, if you don't have that pain, then what is wrong in the first place, right? How can you say that communism, socialism is bad if it doesn't feel bad? If it feels great, it makes no sense. So logically, you have to have the pain of the materialized action from socialist-oriented policies come to fruition before people really start to feel that financial struggle and go, oh my gosh, what have we done? And so that's the reality of political reality. You don't get the change until people are genuinely suffering, unfortunately, in most cases. It's not always. There's always a means that, sometimes there's a type of, cultural underbelly movement that rises up and kind of change things before it's too late. That can definitely happen. But it's unfortunately for a lot of people, especially if they're checked out or they get comfortable, especially it happens with prosperity, that they don't care until it's too late and they're really starving. So I think Javier Milei's election is a wonderful signal. I don't care, about what could possibly happen with him, and maybe he gets assassinated or maybe he gets corrupted. I don't know. To me, that's not really the end sight right now. The sight right now is that people have gotten so frustrated that an unapologetic libertarian, someone who literally says to shove the state up your butt, you know what I mean? Like that level of fervor just won, right? And not just by a small percentage here, a significant percentage. So we have, in a country of about 46 million people, a popular election, a popularity contest where someone who's unapologetically libertarian, open about liking Mises and Hayek and Rothbard, and who calls out socialists on the left with anger on TV. And personal favorite of mine, I will say, is also a cosplayer and a fan of having a little fun with music and dressing up. He's out there winning. So to me, this is amazing. It's showing the cultural shift. And this is what I always say with election stuff. A voluntarist, I still think political realities matter, and they are signs for what is to come. Right? If you're seeing this type of change at the political level, where you're seeing libertarians get into office, and this is a historic event, people are trying to say, "Oh, this has been done before." Like, no, it hasn't. Not a single person ever has been elected as president being openly, unapologetically libertarian, saying their ANCAP, holding up a black and yellow flag. This is an unprecedented in human history event. It is unreal. And if people don't take that into consideration, realize how significant it is, they're going to miss out on what's going on, because this is going to cause people all around South America and up to Latin America, and of course, English speaking countries like here, where people do pay a little attention, to suddenly be like, oh, okay, that's unusual, and to look into who this guy is and what he's done. And if you go to his history, it's pretty hefty on the economics talk, and it's pretty hefty on calling out socialism. This is not someone who's just giving lip service, like Trump, and people try to compare him to Trump. It's like, this guy's nowhere near what Trump is, not even remotely close. You have to be absolutely crazy to think that he is anything remotely close to what Trump is in terms of his actions and past beliefs, in terms of how he's presented them. I mean, it is a diametrically opposed thing. So, I ignore all the stupidity and the hate and all this other stuff that comes out with it. Would say like, oh, but he's a Zionist, or, oh, he said good stuff about Ukraine. I'm like, yeah, and so does every other freaking Western government that's supplying them with weapons and money and all this other stuff. The difference is that this guy is actually talking about real economists, real economics, unapologetically, and getting people to look into these things who would never, ever, ever come across this anywhere else. They would never see this in a public school. They would never see this on the nightly news at prime time. And now they are, because this guy decided to be an unapologetic, charismatic, crazy, 70s style hair guy who's, just going to get your attention and be wild with it. He just ran with it. So again, it just doesn't matter to me whether he is, is he a CIA puppet, or is he this, that? I don't care. You look at what happened, and you look at the effects, and you count that. You count that and what's going to happen. Just like with Snowden, right? I don't care whether Snowden is a CIA asset or a Russian asset. What did Snowden say and do, right? Did Snowden cause a bunch of people to be like, oh, crap, the U.S. government's actually really corrupt and they're spying on us, right? Is that what happened? Or did he make people go, oh, the government's great? Right. So you just got to look at the net effect. What is actually taking place with the person, and appreciate that. And we have to take everything else, whatever later on as it comes, because political realities may be different. There can be corruption. There could be, all different types of things going on, behind the scenes. We don't know. We won't even maybe know for sure, because it's so distant from us. But we know at a minimum that this person, for the past, solid at least 7-8 years, has been unapologetically ANCAP in his rhetoric, has called out socialism and communism, has been effective at, rallying people together for this and creating a kind of branding culture with it. And personally, I already knew about him from way long ago, because the person who did his costume actually reached out to me about Voluntarism, because she was looking at my stuff when designing it. So that's another story. But, basically he was already on my radar. So I kind of had a little idea of who he was and all this other stuff from years back. But to see him now become, an actual head of Argentina is pretty wild. You know what I mean? That's something that's pretty unreal to think about. When you think about what many would say, especially these past 5-6 years, they're like, oh, libertarian can never win. Oh, what's the point? They could never get popular support. You got to either, if you're pragmatic, water down the message, or, oh, you're not going to be taken seriously if you are too charismatic and funny and goofy and silly and calling out people and, bombastic. And I'm just laughing at these people, because this is, definitely what I've been preaching and doing for over 10-15 years at this point. We're talking about me actually doing more outreach, as opposed to just being a learning person. And we've always, that is both me and philosopher, have always had a very much be in your face, unapologetic libertarian message. We're going to change the culture. We don't care what you have to say or what the naysayers say. We're going to do this whether you like it or not. So I think that more people need to adopt his mentality at a bare minimum. At a bare minimum, people need to be comfortable calling out socialists and communists and not giving them an inch. And that's certainly something that we've always been about, not giving them an inch, because if you do, you're essentially lending credence to the idea that the government is going to ethically and effectively centrally plan and do violence. And that's the opposite of the direction we're trying to go in. We're trying to get people to think outside the state. So the only way you get there is to get people to actually think outside the state consistently, no exceptions. So, if we can appreciate those aspects and those wins and ride off of that, that is, celebrate what's good, right? Don't ignore the bad or not call that out, but celebrate what's good about this, and then use that as a platform to continue to do outreach and get people like, okay, so this guy won, so what's he about? Well, let me tell you. Let me tell you what he means when he says he supports Austrian economics, or he wants to end central banking or whatever else. He wants to cut these agencies. Why is he saying this? Okay, let's talk about it. So it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity, and those who don't seize it are wasting a great time to be had with this wonderful event. And those who do seize it and use it as an opportunity to educate others are going to have the blessings of what that will reap in terms of long-term sustainable culture change of people who are now curious and actually seeking and are looking for people, thought leadership to give them the guidance of what they need to fully understand what it is that this guy was all about, and why he got so popular in the first place.
The libertarian movement, I wouldn't even say has gotten their foot in the door. I'd say that the libertarian movement is now completely in the room with this. We have something now that we can really point to. Although I've got to say, I really am kind of interested in that story you were talking about with the costume designer. So I don't mean to pry, but that just seems like a very interesting connection, that, you would be involved in a circle, that wide, that you're actually connected with somebody such as Milei. Have you had any direct contact with his, election, with his campaign team or anything?
No, not like that. It's just that when I think they were dating at the time, but Lilia, and I always say it wrong, Lemonade. It's Spanish, so I'm not exactly sure the pronunciation. But basically, at the time, she was looking to figure out how to make his costume, right? Because he wanted to create this Captain ANCAT costume. So she was searching up symbols, searching up designs, and then came across my stuff. And then she reached out to me, was like, hey, this is awesome. I love what you're doing. She's like, we got a real one named Javier in Argentina. I was like, oh, awesome. Well, thank you. I'm like, well, feel free to check out, everything we're doing here. And I'm excited to see what you do with your stuff. And she's like, oh, yeah. And if you ever want, us to do something, with cosplay stuff, like, let me know. And I was like, oh, okay, great. And I'm like, and I didn't particularly follow up with her about, anything of that, because it was just like, oh, okay, you're in Argentina. I mean, what am I going to do about that? You're pretty far away, but I'm glad that you're at least checking out the Voluntaria stuff and are using that as a basis to kind of think about what kind of design possibilities you could do for his cosplay. And she did her own suit too, and she wore that on TV. So I was definitely way ahead of everybody else when it came to him and knowing what was going on with his career, just because being connected to that community. And a big part of our fandom too with some of our music actually comes from both Brazil and Argentina. There's a big ANCAT community in Brazil and Argentina. As you can see, obviously, that's the reason how we won. So me and Far are a bit more internationally minded. Some people are only looking at US things, but we have a pretty worldwide view when it comes to being connected with different people doing liberty things around the world. We keep pretty steeped on the global scale of things. So we have a good sense of what's going on with events and political dealings in certain other countries where there's some liberty activism going on.
Just basically looking at the whole Malay situation, this is something where I'm certainly, hoping and praying that this will become more of a widespread trend as well. That perhaps other countries will see that this has happened, and since it has happened, it could very well happen again in other places, especially depending on how well Malay's presidency turns out. I know that there is unfortunately going to be some element of the most democratic process, the parliament of Argentina getting in the way. They might try to hinder his progress to some extent, but he works with such a drive and such a ferocity that I think he'll definitely still be able to accomplish some great things. So I'm very hopeful about this, and I do hope it spreads closer, so that people around the U.S. as well are able to turn more towards libertarianism and stop seeing it as just some novelty third party, and more as a very legitimate philosophy that would in fact benefit this nation much more than the current path that we're on. So going off of that, though, I think I don't want to say that Malay's success is strictly because of the dire economic situation in Argentina, but also I think, like you were alluding to, due to his own his own persona, his own approach. This is somebody who has a very in your face style, somebody who's able to reach out to people and really draw them in just through his own personality, that is. So this kind of draws to mind, certain things at home. I know that the Libertarian Party, New Hampshire, for example, on Twitter, different forms of social media from the Libertarian Party, they have a more aggressive attitude as well. Now living in the digital age, we're able to see, in real time, this libertarian movement say these things that would have been considered so shocking many years ago, but now this has become almost commonplace. And I think this is also a very good thing in the long run as well. This is going to draw in more people, and it's going to allow, more honesty, and it's going to allow us to rip through the facade that the state has created over the years. So basically, I'm kind of curious what you think of the Libertarian Party New Hampshire as a counterpoint to Malay. If you think that, what you think of their branding strategy, and if you think there's anything they should improve on, or if in this case, if they should just continue going full steam ahead with the same, aggressive approach that they've been taking.
Yeah, I mean, LPNH is a little more dynamic in a lot of ways because they've had a different set of cycles of people coming in and out and managing their social media. So it's unlike Javier, where it's like, it's one guy, you can point to the guy. Oh, this is what he says, this is what he does. LPNH kind of has a mixture of people who have come in and out over years, and you have different kinds of messaging at different times. I think LPNH is not doing what Javier is doing personally. I think Javier is actually doing something much different from them. And what he's doing different is he is being scathing towards socialists and communists. Like he is calling out the ideas and the corruption with ferocity. LPNH, depending, sometimes they do that. Sometimes they might do something that's more like, clickbaity, or it's like edgy on like racial grounds or something like that, where it just is not what he's doing. It's very different. And I think LPNH could learn from him how to balance those things. How do you be that edginess and charismatic, but without getting lost in collectivist rhetoric potentially, or into kind of baiting posts that are a little more culture war than actually getting to the pushback on the socialists and the communists, right? Javier Milei, I think, embodies that strong critique and that anger against the government and central planning and statism in that way. And I think that is really what you need. And I think that's what we did too back in the day with Anarchy Ball, when we were, hitting it up with the memes and really crushing the culture war back then and getting on a wider scale of things. There was culture war stuff here and there, but it wasn't the main focus. We were there to be scathing against the socialists and the commies and the mainstream parties. And so I think that is where the Libertarian Party New Hampshire, their comms team, could pick up some directional cues from Javier. I think that he is doing a good job of balancing charisma and focusing that hatred and vitriol on the state and on central planners and on the leftists, but without it necessarily losing traction of like personalized attacks that might tie into something that's more race related, or something that's just not really like the core root. You know what I'm saying? So I think if they learn from him in that way and apply that, I think that they will have even more success personally, without the contradictions and the conflicts that come with edge content posting. So yeah, I think that that's what they could take away from him, especially.
Right. Yes. I do think you're hitting on the nail on the head there. one thing I found as far as basically the whole way that a lot of libertarians approach, getting their ideas across, I do find that a lot of them have their hearts in the right place. And while they are correct objectively, and I do say this with love, a lot of them really can't argue their way out of a wet paper bag when they're confronted about their ideas. I found that a lot of them do have some trouble, expressing what they're saying and trying to get their arguments across in a way that's really going to persuade people who have some type of bias against libertarianism. And what I find very refreshing about Millet is he's somebody who, almost like some type of a steamroller, can really just push through, these arguments that are laid out before him, to the point where you hear him making these arguments and you think, I really can't believe he's actually saying this right now. I can't believe we have a, established mainstream politician, a president of a country who's out here just actually making these statements. And he's laying them out so thoroughly that, I mean, he almost gives the listener no choice but to follow along with him, in some sense. So I would definitely agree that, he is somebody who has a very energetic style. But unlike the LPNH, I do think that he's able to direct that energy in the proper directions. Whereas with the LPNH, sometimes that they'll take the way that they present their message might give the person that they're critiquing an opportunity to essentially feign offense at what they're saying, where they can essentially, oh, I can't believe you said that. Oh, I'm so offended. And then in turn, instead of actually providing rebuttal to what they're saying, they can just act offended and almost try to withdraw from the conversation. But yes, that's basically, my take on the situation. And I do just want to say I'm very happy about what has happened in Argentina, and I'm very happy to see what happens in the days coming forward.
Yeah, and just real quick to tie to what you just said too. The other thing that Javier does is he can both do the economic stuff, but he does also do sophistic statements or just non-arguments. He does say things that are just calling names or lambasting things, but he focuses on the ideas, right? When he's like, oh, you could shove it up your butt, he's saying to the socialists or communists, right? He does it to the ideas when he talks crude or just does one-liners or put-downs, right? So I think that's really where it's at. You want to have amazing rebuttals to economic things, but if you're responding to someone else's sophistry, right? If you're responding to someone else making some stupid statement, do it where you attack the ideas and say, like, F you, whatever. No, kind of like what FPC is doing. Like, so Firearms Policy Coalition has this whole campaign that's literally, they say the full word, I won't say it your podcast, but F you, no, right? So they do this thing whenever there's a gun grabber saying, oh, you don't deserve to have these rights or you need to have not guns. They just say F you, no, right? So they bring in the one-liner zinger put down. That's not an argument, but it's just meant to be kind of like radical and shocking that it's like, oh, like we don't even care about you. Like you take their sophistry and you shove it back in their face 10 times stronger, right? I think that has effect, right? When you're just mocking their sophistry and mocking their non-argument. But of course, you want to also bring in when there's time to, be real and take down an actual argument or take down a real logical statement, someone trying to construct something against you. Yeah, then you need to be like hard hitting and fast moving with saying, here's why this is, nonsense, and here's the facts about why you're ridiculous and this is not true, that kind of thing. So it's a balance of those things. I think Javier Milei nails that. I think by and large he is probably one of the best, and maybe not the best in recent years, at having the emotional side and the intellectual side balanced in a way where you give the opponent no edge for just generalized defense against you. You just call out their sophistry with extreme eccentricism and passion, and then you also follow up with and here's the economics why everything you've done has destroyed the economy. And I think that there's a lot that people can glean from that.
Yes, I think he makes very good use of Hitchens' razor, the idea that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And I think he does, make good use of that when he has to a lot of these, very, very empty arguments that are presented against his ideas. And I certainly am very pleased with how he's handled it. And I'm very pleased to see where he's going to be taking it from here going forward. From here, I kind of wanted to change gears and play a type of devil's advocate game with you here. So basically, this is something where I've heard in my years, trying to argue for anarcho-capitalism, I've heard a lot of different, criticisms of it. Some of them are just pretty weird. They don't seem to, make much sense. But I figured, some of these are kind of persistent ideas. And by addressing these, we can potentially go ahead and provide some type of a good counter argument to them. And one of the arguments that I've heard, particularly against anarcho-capitalism, which I find, amusing, is people saying that, well, because, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone failed, so doesn't that mean that anarcho-capitalism doesn't work? I personally do not see how Chaz would be considered by any stretch of the imagination an anarcho-capitalist society, as Murray Rothbard described it. But sometimes for some person who's being presented with this argument, they might have a challenging time, essentially articulating the difference here and articulating why that does not rebut, anarcho-capitalism as a concept.
Well, it's interesting because the Chaz thing, I haven't personally ever been there. I met someone who was actually there, though, who's themselves an ANCAP. And although if you looked at him, you wouldn't think he's an ANCAP. He kind of looks he kind of looks like an ANCOM, oddly enough, but he actually is an ANCAP, so it's kind of weird. It throws you off. He's got dreads and stuff that can kind of help, visualize that. But he himself said that with Chaz, that he said actually not by the media's description of it. He said Chaz was actually internally relatively peaceful. He said that actually, generally speaking, it wasn't as like crazy as they were making it. Yeah, there maybe was that one like socialist guy who was like handing out rifles at one point or something, but he said actually by and large people were just chilling. But the root problem there is that it's just there's no property rights. I mean, Chaz was just people in this zone basically just kicking the government out, but it wasn't an establishment of concrete property rights or like justice. It's just people saying, okay, we're going to hang out here and just do whatever. So it's more like this like anarcho, almost commune, not even communism, commune kind of thing. So that of course it can't represent a real society where you have respected agreements and people having homesteads and people actually building the exclusion of others, because everything that people were doing there was also destroying property and people's private businesses and stuff. So that kind of counters that whole thing. That's so it doesn't make any sense. It's all of it is a bunch of abstractions about a situation that is really a conflict between people who have just want to destroy the area and then just chill, and then the private business owners that are already there, and then the government just not doing anything, but then of course nobody else being able to set anything up, and why would they want to? Because it's just a nonsense area. So yeah, I just don't see that as being what anarcho-capitalism is in any form or function. It's actually just a battle between a mixture of interesting people who have different agendas, the state, and then the private business owners that were already there.
That's pretty much the rebuttal that I've given to people who, in the very rare cases where I've heard that argument used against me, but that's pretty much along the same lines of what I was using. Another argument that I've heard pretty frequently is saying that yes, taxation might be theft, but once we're done paying for the private education, the private security, the private roads in place of all these government-run entities that we have currently, wouldn't we really just be paying the same amount of money anyway? Would it really improve our quality, our standard of living, even if we have the choice between these different options? And even if we did end up with more money, if everybody now has money, wouldn't economically, companies just raise their prices, if everybody has more funds? This would be a similar dilemma that pops up to, Andrew Yang's universal basic income. Some people are saying that from an economic standpoint, there's just not much incentive to even establish an anarcho-capitalist society, because they're saying that we'd really be in the same position anyway, financially.
Well, I mean, that's a complicated topic because there's lots of things to discuss when you're talking about what is versus what could be. And that's why I did write a whole book talking about those transitional things. Oops, wrong one. With a vision for a libertarian future. There we go. Just showing that off. So there's a lot to unpack. The simplest thing, though, to discuss there is just the economic principle of the central planning issue and the economic calculation problem. When the government is forcing their one-size-fits-all solutions, obviously you don't have competition. You don't even know what the alternatives could be, cheaper, more efficient, ultimately could be. But we know in reality that when you have decentralized creation and value provision, then people figure out through decentralized means what are the best and most efficient means to meet people's wants and needs, and people choose those, based on their own market choices. And this drives, competition in a healthy way that causes improvement in quality and, of course, affordability. When we're talking about so many different things that we have right now with the government. There's so much the government's intervened on, so many areas that it's not something you could just talk about readily, in a transition. You have to talk about what's changing, in terms of control over roads and who's doing what and privatization. So that's why for me, I take more of the incrementalist approach. So my ideal in terms of trying to get people on board and changing minds is this idea that we need to get government to the point where a free market in solutions can outmode the government and out-evolve the government. We need a natural erosion of the state, and that happens by freeing the market, right? So as libertarians, our goal should be to move away from tax-oriented funding for government actions and to move toward ending victimless crime laws and allowing robust competition. And I think that is where we get to see the efficiencies, because if the government's not in the way of people providing solutions, now you have that process and that speed for people to actually come up with alternatives and to make the next waves and evolutions of people's flourishing. So we're not going to see that until the government, gets out of the way. I mean, they've done all kinds of things to prevent people from evolving, even banning Uber for planes with the FAA, basically stopping people from evolving air travel. Meanwhile, in other countries, they're literally piloting drone taxis and stuff like that, like crazy futuristic things that, okay, we could be on the next level already where you like take a drone taxi to go from one place to another and all this stuff. And here we are having to deal with the government saying, no, you can't do that. So it's just, there's so much nonsense. There's so much intervention that really needs to be unraveled first. And that's kind of the goal here is we need our own Javier Milei moment. We need a cultural revolution, in favor of body and property rights. We need to get the government out of the way so that we can have an ethical and effective market transition by the market outmoding the state and people starting to choose alternatives to the state. And I think that's the most ethical and natural means to eroding state power is by enabling private persons to come up with better solutions and then say, yeah, I'd rather, not use the government service, just like the post office, right? You know what I mean? If you actually had under 13-ounce mail opportunities with competing services, would everyone stay with USPS? Not necessarily, right? If you have alternatives in private dispute resolution for civil law, maybe not criminal law at the onset, but at least civil, which already exists. It's not even a weird thing. You have arbitration and you have mediation. What happens if that becomes more robust and there's means to having civil dispute outside the state that's just more efficient, less costly, gets to the root, that kind of thing. That's the whole point. We need to get to a point where the government is out of the way so that people can choose the better alternatives. And eventually people are like, over time, I'm going to move away from state services, most likely in most areas, simply because the private market involves getting robust feedback and robust choice and people being able to choose who is doing the best job as opposed to being forced to choose the government, regardless of whatever it is that they're doing or how efficient they do it or how effectively they do it. You're forced to fund it. If you're no longer forced to do that, now you have the opportunity to do something better.
In any case, if nothing else, we would at least have the freedom to choose in each of these areas, which I think that, if nothing else, is still something of a victory, because it would give the person providing that service an incentive to actually provide a better service in that case. But I think this also kind of ties into another argument, I've been hearing pretty often. Some people will tell me that, government is necessary because look at all of the countries that have governments and look at how few successful countries are anarchist. Now, the rebuttal that I would provide to this is that this is really a post hoc fallacy. The fact that the world consists of many more statist societies than anarchist ones, that doesn't mean that the inevitable conclusion to draw here is that forming a centralized government is required for a society to function. I would say that there could just as easily be other explanations for this trend, and in particular, I would posit that alternatives to centralized government are in fact not currently allowed or permitted to be implemented because the people behind the state are using force to prevent them from being put into practice. So on a side note, I'd also have to ask, how great is the government really? Because politicians in NATO, we see them continuously escalating conflict with Russia, with Israel and Palestine. We see World War III on the table at the moment, and I certainly hope for the world's sake that this does calm down and that cooler heads do prevail than the ones that are currently in charge. And if we look at the situation here domestically, our money's value has been crippled. What's been done to the value of our dollar over the past century is honestly, I would say, one of the greatest atrocities in history when we look at the consequences of fiat currency on our standard of living. Statists, they'll be very quick to credit the government for things that the government doesn't even deserve credit for. They'll say, hey, you silly anarcho-capitalist, if the government is so lousy, how come you received your mail on time? Or thank the government that you were able to walk down your street without getting shot. So basically, when I hear these arguments, it's really hard to take a lot of them seriously. This is something that, as for that former one about the mail, I wouldn't go into a whole tangent about Lysander Spooner or the story of the American Letter Mail Company, but I do advise that people read up on that, agonizingly overlooked part of history. And just as for our physical safety and security, I would ask what government cops have to do with that. I mean, like you're saying, these cops can't really protect me from getting robbed through taxation. If I want to hire my own private security and voluntarily pay this firm, as an alternative with my own money instead of getting taxed for the state police, these government cops certainly aren't going to protect my right to make that choice. And I don't mean to sound as though I'm ranting here, but I just think it's deeply fallacious to give the government credit for anything, especially for services where it has used the law to render all potential alternatives and competitors in providing that service illegal. Statists, they're going to praise the government for things that don't depend on the government in the first place, but then they'll refuse to acknowledge the negative effects of the policies that were directly put into place by the government. Anyway, though, I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. But yes, I've noticed a trend for a lot of people to essentially credit the government or say that we need government because of things that were, problems that were caused by the government in the first place. And I'm just curious what you think would really be a good rebuttal to people who try to present these arguments.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the fun examples I like to talk about when it comes to this is the Maesi Kryong ski resort in North Korea. So there's this big ski resort that the North Koreans have, and it's basically a big attraction for them. And they kind of use it as this talking point for the government to say, look, see, the North Korea government's so wonderful. Here's this ski resort that looks like it's 50 years ago aged, and see how wonderful the government is. Without the government, you wouldn't have a ski resort. Mm-hmm. So it's a great example of this thinking, where you can watch interviews of people who are maintaining or actively being at this resort, especially the North Koreans themselves, praising the government for how amazing it is that they gave them the ski resort. And you see how indoctrinated and brainwashed they are to think that, oh, only the government could possibly make a nice ski resort, and it doesn't even look that nice. So the same thing applies in every other area of government interference. When the government occupies a zone of economic activity to the exclusion of others, and through force and law, makes it so no one could compete, then people cannot see what the alternatives are, because the alternatives are banned from coming to fruition. And so that is the age-old problem with governments and hiding the nature of their thefts and distortions, is that by denying alternatives, people think that, oh, well, without the government, we wouldn't have this. Like if they monopolize t-shirt production, they think, oh, we wouldn't have t-shirts or shoes if not for the government. So that's what it boils down to, is that governments work best at deceiving people into thinking that without them they'd be nothing, by occupying areas of innovation and industry and tricking people into believing that this couldn't be done otherwise. So the more people recognize that, and I think sometimes it's easiest when you don't look at your own government. You look at other governments that you think are bad, and you see how they monopolize things, and you see their propaganda. You're like, oh, okay, I can see it there. It's a little easier to get people to recognize it. So I like bringing up that North Korean example as a quintessential example of government occupying a certain area of industry and then pretending that nobody else could do it. And of course, anybody else around the world who is familiar with ski resorts would laugh at this and be like, yeah, of course you could have ski resorts without the government. They're everywhere, and way nicer ones that are private. So it's laughable. That's kind of a way to kick people off on that road of thinking, is showing people different governments that occupy certain areas and then others that don't, and showing the flourishing. It's like, see, it's not exactly what you're claiming it is.
it's a lot easier if we can detach from our own relationship with our own government and kind of see it as almost a third person looking at the government of another nation, so we can examine it that way. And basically, what you're talking about with that ski resort, it almost reminds me of some critiques I've heard in the past of people saying that, well, look at how poorly the withdrawal from Afghanistan went. They'll say, because there was no government there, it became such a disaster zone over there. And I'll say, how do you think it became that way in the first place? How do you think this horrible, situation was set up? It's mainly, and so the thing here is, I consider myself to be something of a gradualist in the approach to setting up an anarcho-capitalist society. And I know this is kind of a polarizing stance among some of my peers, but the reason for this is not because of any inherent flaw in anarcho-capitalism. It's because the roots of the state are so deep currently. If we just snapped our fingers and the government disappeared in these areas where it has a complete monopoly in, that would be a problem, because there would now be a total vacuum in this area and there'd be nobody able to provide that service. And even if that's for a very brief period of time, that could lead to catastrophic consequences. So I do believe that in this case, it is best to have some type of, gradual process where something is put into place, just to at least cushion the impact as this transition happens. And I would say that since that was not done in the case of Afghanistan, because we have the government stepping in and creating this completely unviable situation, that's why the withdrawal in that case was the disaster it was. I would say that is by no means an argument for the necessity of government, but in a military context, that is something I do see very often.
Right. And there wasn't privatization as part of the withdrawal. They left some weapons and stuff like that, but right. It's not like, oh, okay, and we're going to help establish private property rights. And
right.
And the Taliban, they're totally not here and armed by the U.S. government, and they're not trying to set up a new government themselves. It's a lot of nonsense. The reality is it's all, government distortions. And I agree with you there. I talk about that in my Vision for a Libertarian Future book, that we do need incrementalism and some gradualism, because there are issues where a lack of privatization will create a big problem, right? All the nuclear weapons, nearly 3,000, maybe 4,000 potentially of those. You can't just have a rapture of all government workers and then just think, oh, that'll be fine. 4,000 nuclear warheads. What could possibly go wrong, right? So you need ways to deal with government apparatus and things, that are either destructive or people are dependent on, and suddenly losing that would of course be catastrophic. You need to have privatization, denuclearization, and other things like that to move property held or assets held by the government into private hands, and to allow the market to kind of grow and replace those government functions. So I completely agree with you there, and that's been a part of my work, just because I did find that to be such a big gap. We definitely had the philosophy out there in terms of the principles. We definitely had the philosophy in terms of a vision of what's possible in terms of a perfect ANCAP situation, as a theoretical outcome. But we didn't have a point A to point B plan laid out in terms of, okay, what's the incremental advocacies? How can we get there? And that's why I wrote those books that I did, to help people get in that mindset and think about how to move toward a true libertarian order and toward a true free market.
Right. Yes, I would certainly, concur with that. Now, from here, I guess, just to kind of wrap things up and, move towards a conclusion, one question I'd like to ask, I'm kind of curious what your take on this would be, is just in a more general sense, why should people care about libertarianism? Why shouldn't they just find the subject boring and simply ignore it? Because libertarianism is not a material object, for example. It's just an idea. It's a concept, really. And I've noticed that psychologically, in terms of what people tend to take interest in, they tend to have some type of a preference toward actual material goods, material objects that they can put in their hands, whereas actual ideas, for the majority of the population, doesn't seem to really rope them in. So what kind of case would you make for people that they should, in fact, care about libertarianism, that it should actually be one of the foremost things that they do care about?
Sure. So if you take libertarianism alone, it might not be as juicy. But if you combine it in the broader philosophical context, philosophical voluntarism and libertarianism, I think it becomes much more robustly applicable to people's lives, because the principles there in the total package sense inform how you have healthy and respectful relationships as relates to other people, friends, loved ones, children. It informs your understanding of good business relationships and honoring agreements and how to do things, effectively and communicate effectively. It informs you about how to move toward a more prosperous future, right? If you can understand these principles, you can also know what the government's doing that's bad, and in many ways even find ways to circumvent those issues for yourself. How to think outside of the state's fiat when it comes to your own personal wealth and savings and planning for the future. A lot of libertarian and voluntarist philosophy in the broader context, when we go beyond just the bare bones economics and the base ethics, when we tie in what I present, you get to think about what it is that you can do to help yourself avoid poverty, and how to avoid the punitive nature of government fiscal policy. So there are a lot of benefits that go beyond the basics, and I think that if you take the time to understand all those things and the extension topics beyond just the bare bones principles, which again, even those there, just even respecting someone else's property is huge. Just knowing that the people you associate with won't mess with your body, they won't mess with your stuff. That's kind of a big deal, as opposed to a communist roommate who thinks, I could take your drink out of your fridge because you didn't lock it. Maybe you're in a college dorm room or something, right? You don't want to be around that person, right? You don't want to be around that college dorm mate. So you want to be friends with people who respect you, physically and your stuff. That's at a bare minimum. That's a big deal. So there's a lot of reasons why understanding this philosophy matters, and the associated extension topics matter. And if you take the time to understand those things, you're going to find yourself deeply enriched in every area of your life, having healthier communication, having healthy relationships with loved ones, and possibly even doing better for yourself financially. Just understanding markets, understanding the business cycle, as created by the Fed, understanding sound money versus government and fiat and currency. There's a lot that you could glean from it and really benefit yourself with.
Right. Yes. I would certainly agree with that. As far as I'm concerned, libertarianism may not be everything, but it makes everything better once it's applied. But yes, I really am, grateful to you for appearing on this show, Jack. I really do appreciate that. And for anybody listening, I do recommend that they check out The Voluntarist, as well as your nonfiction works, and certainly check out your music as well. So once again, thanks for coming on the show, Jack. I really do appreciate that. And thank you everybody out there for tuning in. This has been Morgan Meets the Eye. So make sure to follow Jack and myself, and subscribe to this show. And above all, keep asking why. Everybody out there, have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Evan.